if you remember the last couple times I talked, I talked to you about a dream I had about the Lord coming back and that it was time to start exercising faith. So as I pondered that, I felt the Lord really encouraging me to continue talking about exercising faith. That's why I'm starting Romans today. Because of all the New Testament books, that has a huge amount to say about faith and what faith looks like and what it is. So I'll be talking about, this is like part one, and the guys were kidding me when I gave them the flash drive with this on it because there's a ton of slides. And I already knew I was going to have to do it in two parts, the two-part introduction, because every time I speak for the next year or two, probably I'll be talking about Romans and the gospel. The guys challenged me to see if I could beat Trevor for the most slides ever done in a single service. And I could, but I don't want to hurt you. And I'm afraid that in my race to try to beat Trevor, there would be collateral damage, that your eyeballs would be rolled back in your head permanently. And I don't want that. But we are going to talk about Romans. And the introduction is cool because when I got ready to teach this, I went back and looked at, okay, what was Paul writing to and why did he say the things he did? Okay, it is on. And I am not moving anything. Okay, so Paul's theme in Romans is the gospel of God's power unto salvation for everyone who is believing. We'll talk a little about this today, but that's really the central theme in Romans is the gospel. But here's the gospel of works. You can see that chin-up bar in the door frame, and the poor guy exercising had bad results. Despite his sincere intentions and best efforts, Norman's attempts at self-improvement always ended in disaster. Listen, the harder we try to make ourselves righteous or more pleasing to God, to each other, by doing stuff, the more it's going to hurt us and hurt other people. The gospel of works leads to death, which hopefully you all want to avoid. Now, the heart of the gospel is in Romans 1, verse 16 through 17, for I am not ashamed of the good news or the gospel of the Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation to everyone who is believing, both to the Jew first and to the Greek or Gentile. For the righteousness of God in it is revealed, and that's literally being revealed or uncovered. It's an ongoing process. From faith to faith, according as it has been written, and the righteous one will live by faith. So this is so pregnant with stuff. If I get bogged down, it's going to be on this slide. I am not ashamed. Now, why would Paul say that? Why would Paul say, I'm not ashamed of the gospel? Well, because to Jews, that was an offense. To the Greek, it made no sense at all. Now, if you stop and think about if all the issues in today's world, it almost feels kind of stupid sometimes to say the gospel is the solution. We can feel like people are going to think, well, that's a little stupid. That's a little naive. The good news of the gospel of the Christ, the power of God. That's from the Greek dunamis, which is dynamite. How many of you would love to see the power of God as it was in the early church released here? Okay, where does this say the power of God is? It's in the gospel. There is a dynamite power of God that is released with the proclamation of the gospel. Why aren't we seeing it? I think it's because we've lost the fact that this is the power of God unto salvation. We want signs and wonders to convince people, but where is God's power found? It's found in the gospel. And that's pretty cool. To salvation. That is related to the Greek word sozo, which doesn't just mean getting saved so you don't go to hell. That word means much more than that. It means like fullness. It means wholeness. It sort of means completeness. It's like things being put back together again. So if we stop with thinking about the gospel as, well, that's how you get saved, we missed it. Because that's not just the kind of salvation Paul's writing about. It runs much, much deeper so that everything in us comes into wholeness and alignment with the way God designed and created us to be in Christ. So it is an ongoing process that is far beyond just salvation. For everyone who is believing, do you know you can get saved and stop believing the gospel? How many times have you wanted to get born again? Today. Do you know why that is? Because we stopped believing the gospel. There is something profound about believing the gospel day after day after day. And all that Paul's going to write about and talk about, all that's packed into it. And part of what I want to do in the series on Romans is unpack that, because it is way cool. It's far beyond what I could think or imagine. And it's to the Jew first and to the Gentile. Alan's been teaching us a lot about the message to Jews and to Gentiles, or Greeks or barbarians, as that word meant. For the righteousness of God. Now think about that for a minute. It's not Ed's definition of righteousness. It's not your definition of righteousness. It's not a theologian's definition of righteousness. But what is revealed is what God says is righteousness. And it is being revealed, meaning it's an ongoing process. To quote Alan, it's mystery. And the mystery still being revealed. It's not finished. God's righteousness can be revealed from day to day to day as we're believing it. And as it is written, the righteous one will live by faith. Now this slide picks up that righteousness will live by faith a little bit. For in the gospel of righteousness which God ascribes is revealed, both springing from faith and leading to faith. So when you get a little bit of it, the gospel provides more. As it is written, disclosed through the way of faith that arouses to more faith. As it is written, the man who through faith is just and upright shall live and shall live by faith. Now, the Amplified has a lot to say about that. It just means believe and continue to keep on believing steadfastly, is really what that's talking about. So it's, do you believe in Jesus? Well, yeah, I got saved in 1978. It's not just then, but it's, am I believing in Jesus today? And what he says about me is true because of the gospel, that he is continuing to work out in me because it's his power to bring me to wholeness. So hopefully I didn't get too bogged down there. We can't stop at the promises of salvation in chapter 3 of Romans. because that's where you find salvation in Romans. That is a lot like if Exodus stopped after the people crossed the Red Sea. Okay, they were saved from, but what are they saved unto? Because after chapter 3, Paul really gets into what we're saved unto. And that's the really exciting part for me. Could this be the year of second chances to believe the gospel for myself and other people around me? It's not just believing it for me, but we can believe the gospel is true for other people. How many of you have children that struggle? What if we believed that the gospel is true for them and acted like they were that person God says they are? I'm telling you from experience, trying to deal with children is one of the places I learned to believe the gospel for people. Because I can't control it, I can't fix it, I can't do anything about it. But is what God says about them true, regardless of how they're behaving right now? It's awesome. That's God's power being released through faith into their lives. It's very cool. So, introduction. Here are the things I want to talk about during the introduction. And number 4, unless I try to beat Trevor's record, I will not get to that. Okay. But I do want to try to get through at least the first 2, and we'll see how we're doing for number 3. So that is a statue of St. Paul out in front of, I cannot remember the name of the building in Rome. Now, if you'll notice all these pictures, I've got Paul's holding a sword. I couldn't understand that, so I looked it up. They wrote that because of the sword of the Spirit, which Paul wrote about. But pictures of the early martyrs often had them pictured with the thing that killed them. So that's why Paul's always pictured holding a sword in these pictures. So when did Paul write Romans, and where does it fit with other New Testament writings? Now, it's somewhere around 57 to 58. Some people say late 56 into 57, but it's probably that little window. Now, here are the books of the New Testament, and you'll see where Romans fits. James was the first, followed by Thessalonians, Paul's first letters, Thessalonians, and the Galatians and Corinthians. Then comes Romans. That is followed by all the other New Testament books. It's followed by the prison epistles, Ephesians, Galatians, Philippians, and Colossians, and then the Gospels, then his letters to Timothy. So Romans is uniquely positioned because it's after Paul did a whole lot of ministry, but before he wrote most of his letters to churches he'd been to. He probably wrote this from Corinth at the end of his 3rd missionary journey. Now, Paul's home base was Antioch. That's where he'd go out from and come back to. When he planned to return to Jerusalem with an offering. So Paul's done 3 journeys. He's about finished with the 3rd, and he's going to bring an offering to Jerusalem. His missionary trips throughout the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire were just about done. He wanted to leave Greece, go to Jerusalem, then Rome, and finally to Spain. In Acts, Luke tells us Paul spent 3 months in Greece before he started his journey. It's likely that Paul wrote Corinth from over those 3 months. Now that verse says, how do we also know that Paul wrote from Corinth? Well, he gives the letter to Phoebe to bring it to the Romans. Phoebe was a deaconess from the church in, I tried to write out the pronunciation because these sound so different than the way they're spelled. I think it's Kangrahi, which is a seaport next to Corinth. and he appointed her to carry his letter. He also mentions Gaius, where Paul is staying, which is probably the same one Paul baptized at Corinth. And the last guy, Erastus, he mentions, and there's an inscription in Corinth to Erastus, that guy, inscribed in Corinth, the city commissioner. So it really looks like Paul wrote from Corinth. Now, why is the date so important? Unless you're a Bible nerd and you just like that stuff. By the time Paul wrote Romans, his missionary travels throughout the Eastern Roman Empire to the Ephesians, Galatians, Thessalonians, Corinthians, Philippians, and all the others were complete. We don't have a really detailed record except what Paul mentions in those letters about what in the world he preached. So Romans is probably the most complete picture of what Paul preached to found the churches and help establish faith in the very early churches, which makes it unique. And remember, Paul only preached where nobody else preached. So if you're wondering what did Paul start these churches with, it's what he's going to talk about, especially in the first 8 chapters of Romans. It's the only New Testament letter that Paul never visited or started. He hadn't been there yet. It's a detailed account of the Gospels, and that's what makes it unique. So why did Paul write? Paul's about to start new missionary work. Have any of you ever had to do a fundraising letter for ministry? How many of you have gotten fundraising letters? Okay, those are terrible to have to write because you're basically trying to let people know, A, I'm credible, I'm not fly-by-night. No, I'm not going to sit under a palm tree in Hawaii someplace or a nice tropical paradise. I'm not going skiing. But here's my bona fides, is what they would say in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? There's my bona fides. This is why I'm legitimate and you don't have to worry about me. That's a lot of what Paul put into Romans because he's getting ready to do some new missionary work. He completed his task in Asia Minor, and all those eastern provinces. The churches were functioning on their own, and Paul's getting ready to launch new ministry in a new territory, which is Spain and Western Europe. He only preaches in unreached territory. So Paul says, I will not venture to speak of anything except what Christ has accomplished through me in leading the Gentiles to obey God through what I've said and done, by the power of signs and wonders, through the power of the Spirit. So from Jerusalem all the way to Illyricum, sounds like leprechauns. I fully proclaim the gospel of Christ. It's always been my ambition to preach the gospel where Christ was not known, so not build on someone else's foundation. So Paul's getting ready to go to Spain and Western Europe where nobody has been before. Basically says this in verse 22, this is why I've often been hindered from coming to you, because he's wanted to go to Rome for a long time. But now there is no more place for me to work in these regions. It's tapped out as far as Paul going to places that people have never heard the gospel. And since I've been longing for many years to visit you, I plan to do so when I go to Spain. So Paul's done, whole new chapter starting. I hope to see you while passing through and have you assist me on my journey. Now, I didn't know this before, but this really is a fundraising letter because help me on my journey, that phrase means help on the way with material support. So I'm going to do new ministry. Will you send me with food? Will you send me with funds? And so the rest of that passage is talking about, look, I've got this collection for the poor. I need to take it to Jerusalem. But after that, when I've completed the task and made sure they've received the contribution, I will go to Spain and visit you on the way. One of Paul's purposes in writing Romans was to prepare for his mission to Spain. A church planting enterprise so far from home's base in Antioch would create all kinds of logistical problems. It's kind of like my base might be in Taylorsville, but if I'm going to start ministering in Korea, that is a long supply line. To be blunt, it's a long supply line. It's hard to get stuff all the way there. So Paul's saying, maybe you'll be my new base so that I can reach these new places. And I talked about the material support. We may then view Romans as Paul's letter of introduction to a church that he hopes to add to his list of sponsors. This would explain the general theological focus of the letter, for Paul would want to assure the Romans that they would be sponsoring a missionary whose orthodoxy was without question. It's part of the reason I think he did such a detailed look at the gospel in the first chapter 8 of Romans. So these guys would go, okay, he's not this crazy, let's throw the law out the window guy that the Jew says he is. He's not this bizarre person causing controversy among the Gentiles everywhere he goes. This is who Paul is. Paul also wanted to impart gifts and have mutual encouragement with the Romans. He wasn't completely mercenary. I thank God through Christ Jesus for all of you because your faith is being reported all over the world. Apparently, this was quite a church if their faith was being reported all over the world. It doesn't mean they didn't have problems because Paul's going to address some very specific issues there. God, who I serve in my spirit, is preaching the gospel of his Son, is my witness how constantly I remember you in my prayers at all times. And I pray now, at last, by God's will, the way may be open for me to come to you. I long to see you so that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to make you strong. That is, you and I may be mutually encouraged by one another's faith. So Paul's not completely mercenary. He hopes there'll be some encouragement in the process. Now, what was the church like in Rome? This is pretty cool. Who started it and what are the problems Paul writes about? Now, there's a picture of Peter and Paul. Guess which one is Peter? He's a dude with the keys. Yeah, remember, I'll give you the keys to the kingdom. Jesus told him. So in pictures of Peter, he's always holding keys. He was crucified upside down on a cross, but that doesn't show up in any of the pictures I found. It's just he's always got keys, and Paul's got a sword and a book. So some say Peter started the church, and some say it was Peter and Paul, and some say it was Paul. There's a lot of controversy about this, especially depending on your faith background. Protestants tend to say, well, it was Paul. Roman Catholics say, well, it was surely Peter. And some say it could be both. Now, honestly, it's really hard to tell because the early church fathers recognized Peter as having a big role in the church. Some commentators believe Peter went to Rome after he was miraculously released from prison in Acts 12. It's obscure. I mean, it's really obscure. Peter motioned with his hand for them to be quiet and described how the Lord had brought him out of prison. Tell James and the other brothers and sisters about this, he said, and then he left for another place. So the people in favor of Peter being the guy that wrote Romans are saying, well, see, started the church in Rome. They say, well, that's where he went. One commentator was saying he would have gone as far as possible from the the legal jurisdiction of Jerusalem, just to get out of sight, to hide, because you can believe Herod wanted to find him and make an example out of him. So they're saying he took off to the last place anybody think of looking for him. Now, tradition affirms that that's what happened. Some commentators believe Peter went to Rome under the reign of Claudius in 42 AD and would become leader of the church until his death under Nero sometime around 67. This was accepted as true by early church fathers and by tradition. He would have not been there permanently and would have had to flee. So even if he was there, it was not a permanent thing. At best, he may have influenced it. So how did the early church get started? I got to grab my coffee. I'm getting hoarse. That's better. So it would have started among Jews in Rome. Now, this was really fascinating to me. I'm a little bit of a history nerd and a Bible nerd, and my nerdiness is showing through. But if you bear with me, you'll understand why this is important for what Paul wrote. There were somewhere around 5 to 7 synagogues in Rome around the time the gospel would have gotten there. Cicero said, you know what a big crowd it is, how they stick together, how influential they are in informal assemblies, and every year it was customary to send gold to Jerusalem on orders from Jews from Italy. Cicero was kind of like a Roman historian, statesman. He's famous for making a lot of speeches. Philo of Alexandria, who was a contemporary, said, the great section of Rome on the other side of the Tiber, now the Tiber is the river that runs through Rome, is occupied and inhabited by Jews, most of whom were Roman citizens emancipated. That means they were formerly slaves but got their freedom. For having been brought as captives to Italy, they were liberated by their owners and were not forced to violate any of their native institutions. They have houses of prayer and meet regularly in them, particularly on the sacred Sabbaths when they receive as a body of training in their ancestral philosophy. So the Jews were in 5 to 7 synagogues practicing Judaism without being restrained in it. They collect money for sacred purpose from their first fruits and send them to Jerusalem. Now, this was interesting to me about the part of the city they lived in. The chief foreign quarter of the city, a district characterized by narrow, crowded streets, towering tenements, teeming with population. It sounds like a ghetto. These guys did not apparently have a whole lot of money because it was overcrowded, tall buildings, narrow streets, probably not the best quarters in Rome. They were there because their ancestors had been taken to Rome as slaves under Pompey. And once freed, the Jews bore the title Libertini. Now, why does that matter? Because they were not nice people. You would think the Libertini, having formerly been slaves and freed, would be really nice. Well, guess what the synagogue was that turned Stephen into the Sanhedrin? They were the Libertini. Okay, you would think they might have learned how to be nice. But you can see in Rome, the Jews were a devout bunch. They were practicing Judaism. They didn't deviate. And they didn't react well if you questioned them. Many of the synagogues were in the poorer parts of the city. There were no central organization or leadership that oversaw the synagogues. Ordinary Jews affiliated themselves with Judaism as a whole, and instead of being loyal to a specific synagogue. So they went to synagogue, but they saw themselves as primarily Jews. It wasn't like, well, we're Christians in Taylorsville rather than we go to New Life. It wasn't like that. Now, the problem is the Jews kept getting banished. In 419 AD, 4,000 descendants of enfranchised slaves, Jews and Egyptians, tainted with their superstition and suitable in point of age, were to be shipped to Sardinia and there to be employed in suppressing brigandage. In other words, they took Jewish people who had been freed and they said, we're going to send you to this island off the coast of Italy and you're going to fight pirates. Okay? For whatever reason, there's reasons later, but for right now, they just threw them out and said, you're going to fight pirates. They had orders to leave Italy unless they'd have renounced their impious ceremonies. So it was like, Jews, either you renounce Judaism or you're going to go fight pirates. And when the emperor died, the banishment was lifted. Now, in 41 and 49 AD, the same thing happened again. And this is significant, because Paul is going to write Romans and come to Rome in the middle of a bunch of banishments and the fallout from the banishments. In 41, he ordered that the Jews leave Rome, or at least the leaders, but nobody knows the exact scope of it. But in 49, almost all the Jews were expelled and scattered. A historian says that Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome because they were constantly rioting. Now, is that familiar? Do you find that in the New Testament aside from here? Yeah, you do. Ephesus, major riot in Ephesus. At the instigation of a guy called Chrestus. Now, who was Chrestus? They're saying it's probably a corruption of the Greek Christos, meaning that they were doing what happened in Ephesus. They were rioting over Christ. And you find the same banishment referred to in Acts. Paul left Athens, went to Corinth, where he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who'd recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them and stayed there and did tent making with them. Now, the ban got lifted because in Romans 16, Paul writes, greet Priscilla and Aquila because they're now back in Rome. Let's see. Why is this so important? Aside from Bible nerds, why is this important? It matters because Paul was writing to a divided church. Okay? Think about this. On one hand, you had Jews who probably came, sorry about that. I walked out of where the camera was. On one hand, you had a church that was probably largely Jewish in the beginning, that was started because people on Pentecost were there from Rome, both Jews and Gentiles. So some of them probably took the message back to Rome with them. Some may have gone after Stephen was stoned and the church was scattered. And there's record of at least one guy that was Paul's first convert in Asia that ended up back in Rome. So you had converts from Judaism that were heading back to Rome. So the gospel could have come through them or all those places. What's important is the early church there was mostly Jewish. And then Gentiles started getting saved. Okay, people that didn't have the background of the temple, they didn't know about the Torah, the Jewish laws, they didn't know about circumcision, they didn't know about any of the cultural, traditional practices the Jews had been observing for hundreds of years. And they're added to the church. And things seemed to be going pretty well, but it was primarily a Jewish church. And then Claudius banishes the Jews. So in 41, it may have been the leaders that got thrown out. We don't know if they were part of the church or not. But we do know in 49, all the Jews had to leave. Now, what did that mean for the church in Rome? It meant that all of a sudden Gentiles who probably never held powerful positions in the church were now in charge. Okay, they knew from their experience with the Jews in the church that, okay, this is how we do things, this is how we think about it. But they didn't have that background. The things that may have been important to the Jews didn't make sense to the Gentiles for the most part. So here you have an entirely new group of leaders in the church. And in 54 AD, Claudius died. So what did that mean? Well, the Jews came back to Rome. Now you have a church that was Jewish, now is Gentile, and now has to incorporate Jews back into what the early church meeting in houses had become. Do you understand the potential for division? I mean, suppose that a bad ruler came to the U.S. and it decided, okay, all native people from Alexander County are being deported. Only Yankees can stay. Okay, so now we've had church that's had a lot of Southern roots, which is a fine thing. Okay, I've discovered recently that ancestors a couple generations back actually came from Iredell and Wilkes County, which I never knew before. It does make a difference because things Yankees think are important are a little different than what we think are important here. So imagine then that ruler got thrown out and all the Yankees had to run things for 10 years. And now all of a sudden, all the natives got to come back. Can you imagine the confusion? I mean, aside from the cultural differences, okay, now you got the former leader coming back and having to figure out what do we do with this leadership problem. That would have been a huge leadership problem. And then you got to figure out how are the Yankees and the Southerners going to interact and relate together after been all Yankee for about 10 years. You've got a problem. I mean, a major problem. And this is what's going on in the church in Rome when Paul writes his letter. The church may have been known throughout the world, but it had major problems. And if you look at the structure of Romans, I'm sorry, I got to have another drink again. So if you look at the structure of Romans, Paul goes out of his way in chapter 1 to talk about how we're all sinful. In chapter 2, it really doesn't matter if you're Jewish or Gentile, because we all fall short. In chapters 9 through 11, then, he's talking about, well, what do we make of Jewish people? I mean, what do we do with Israel? Later on in chapters 13, 14, and 15, he's dealing with division. In fact, he says, and it was specifically over an issue like eating meat, which would have been a huge issue going from Gentiles who were serious meat eaters, carnivores, whatever, it's good, to Jewish people who said that could be unclean, let's not mess with it. So he does this whole discussion about why love is the most important, why we need gifts to boost each other up, but then how do we live weak and strong together? Because the truth is, when we disagree over things, we tend to think, well, I'm stronger, and that poor fool over there is the weak one. And that poor fool over there is going, well, I'm the strong one. You're the weak one. So this whole issue of how do you do weak and strong together is critical, and it's part of why Paul wrote the first 8 chapters first. Because if you don't get the power of the gospel to bring change, then the weak and the strong discussion makes you don't have context for it. So I'm kind of excited to know this. Now, maybe I put you to sleep, and I apologize. But I'm excited about this because now I know Paul is writing because he's starting a new missionary trip. He's writing down what he shared in other places that there's no other record of. He's laying out the gospel, which is God's power for wholeness, identity change, what groups look like together, that you can't sin anymore, okay? That the law has no more say over you, and that the leadership of the Holy Spirit will lead you to fulfill all the righteousness that God requires. Pretty cool stuff. So Paul's writing about that, and he's dealing with division, major division. That's a huge problem for the church. So I did not break Trevor's record, which is totally fine. I summarized probably 10 slides, so maybe I can count those. So I'm done. You're getting finished 5 minutes early. Yay, 5 minutes. I want to encourage you. I'll speak again in March, and maybe I'll be out of I do want to talk to you about Habakkuk and how that influences Paul's writing in Romans. Because Habakkuk makes the point in the middle of all kinds of sin, the law is weak, the law is powerless. Then in chapter 2, he's like, well, the righteous will live by faith. Okay, Paul was heavily influenced by Habakkuk, but we'll get to that next time. And then hopefully get into just teaching of Romans. So, Father, I thank you that your gospel is the power of God unto salvation. Lord, I pray that believing will be an ongoing thing. It will not be a one-time deal where we got saved. But you will help us to believe the gospel for ourselves and for other people, that it transform us by bringing wholeness to every part of our lives, that we'll believe the gospel for ourselves and believe it for other people, that we will see them as the value of Christ who died for them. Lord, I pray that it transform the way we see everybody we encounter, because there is so much power in that, Lord. Please do not let us miss it. I pray, Father, that you will keep us warm over the next few days. Selfishly, I would like a little snow. But, Lord, that's not terribly spiritual, I suppose. But, Lord, I just thank you that you are so good. I thank you that you are so good, that your riches are unsearchable. That means we'll never run out of finding them. And I thank you that your righteousness is continually being revealed. Lord, please this week give us further glimpses of the glories of your righteousness as you work that out in our lives. I pray that you infuse us with the power that's in the gospel. Infuse that into us, Lord. And Lord, may your Holy Spirit be our guide, be our teacher that leads us into all righteousness and fulfills every requirement in the law. That we may truly be a people set apart to you.